every environment, from the mainframe to an on-premise system to a various cloud environments, have their own security and identity posture, their own technologies, their only way to do it. So you have to think through how you go and build an integrated model, starting with policies like Eric described, and saying, okay, what is my zero trust model? And most likely you will have to introduce some maturity models where you say, hey, I'm at basic security. That means these things. And then all the way to, okay, I have fully zero trust. That doesn't happen overnight because, as Eric pointed out, life is not that simple.
Hey, welcome back to Armchair Architects as part of the Azure Essential Show. This is our security season, and we're going to get right into it with the architects. So, gentlemen, welcome back. I would really like to expand out a little bit of what we've been talking about, because often we talk about things from like a Microsoft perspective or a single cloud perspective. You know, we talk about Azure a bunch, but I think a really interesting hard problem is, how do you do cloud security in a multi-cloud environment? And how do you architect things so that actually works? And so why is that so hard? Let's talk about the way. I have a guess as to why so, but why is it so hard to do multi-cloud stuff securely?
So David, I would first say, let's not talk about just multi-cloud.
Okay.
Because the world is way bigger than just clouds. There's a lot of on-premise environments. There's a lot of other things that people have to secure as well. And so the scope should be, what does your enterprise look like? What are the resources or assets you use in your enterprise, and how do you secure all of that stuff? And then I think we have a deal here, how we can help our clients and customers out there.
Okay, I agree that you called me properly on that. Why is that so hard? Why is enterprise security so hard?
Let's figure out why it's super difficult, or it's not super difficult, but there's a lot to think about, at least from my perspective. So there's the concept of consistent security policies and where those policies live and what they're implemented through. And these policies focus on everything from resource visibility and access to compliance, especially for customers and people that are in regulated industries. But ultimately, when people go on this journey, it's typically done in a piecemeal fashion. No one expects to be multi-cloud or hybrid cloud when they start. They expect to have one cloud, and then they slowly realize that, hey, there's another service in this other place that's novel and exists at a time where my primary cloud provider doesn't have it. And now I want to have my identity, context, all my ZTA postures kind of travel between these two. Should be easy, right? But what we realize now is that it introduces things like identity fragmentation, inconsistent security controls. Oftentimes, depending on the region and locations of these data centers, it even provides data sovereignty challenges. So like if you're kind of like a financial service institution implementing a multi-cloud strategy, unified identity management may be something that you never thought you'd have to face before. Security risks increase depending on where those regions are around the world. And then if you think federated identity management is going to be your bread and butter, there's a significant amount of design and architecture from an identity perspective that has to go into merging Azure AD with Okta, with IWS IAM and Identity Center, all to achieve SSO and RBAC and ABAC. So there's a significant amount of challenges and planning that needs to go into the establishment of this core identity core.
Yeah, I'll bring it down to the basics a bit, because Eric is already in the complexity. Every environment, from the mainframe to an on-premise system to a various cloud environments, have their own security and identity posture, their own technologies, their only way to do it. And so you have to think through how you go and build an integrated model, starting with policies like Eric described, and saying, okay, what is my zero trust model? And most likely you will have to introduce some maturity models where you say, hey, I'm at basic security, that means, or maturity, that means these things. And then all the way to, okay, I have fully zero trust. That doesn't happen overnight because, as Eric pointed out, life is not that simple. And then you have to go and say, okay, now I understand what I want to achieve. Then you have to look at each of your environments, how they can achieve it. And then you have to make a strategic decision, who is my partner for core components like identity? Again, because you don't want to have a fragmented identity system, because that means you never know really which identity gets executed, who is validating what. So you have to have some, what we call internally the trusted base, that effectively is the core service, the foundation for your zero trust architecture. And that foundation ideally works with everything you have in your enterprise, from multiple clouds to higher level applications, SaaS services. All of this stuff has to ultimately be secured in a single fashion, to get to single sign-on and to traceable security, which is the other half. Because now we have created this model, we now need to make sure that we can monitor it. We can know what is going on. Eric and you, David, mentioned this scenario where all of a sudden Uli shows up in 2 continents within 5 minutes. How do you track that? Who's tracking it? So that you don't have multiple signals that are potentially crossing wires and stuff like that. So you have to think through how do you enable it? How do you monitor it? And then who is going to monitor it? What's your security operations center look like? How do you going to apply machine learning, AI, and other techniques to get a hold or understand if you're a large enterprise, you will get a lot of messages and events. How do you understand what's important, what's not important? How do you react and stuff like that? So there's a cycle that you have to think through, from understanding what you have, how to secure it, monitor it, and then keep enforcing that zero trust architecture across all of your environments. Because if it's just 1 or 2 environments and you don't have the others secured, you clearly don't have a zero trust architecture.
Uli, you also made me think of the human factor here as well. So governance fabric, people, process, and technology, most importantly, the people, now also have to be able to understand that they're not monitoring zero trust exceptions across one identity and access management solution. It could potentially be several, started depending on how many partners you have. And the upskilling and the capability to understand, I'm getting an alert from who and where. And just think about the example that you just talked about, which was Uli logged into Azure at 10 a.m. in Singapore, and now he's logging into AWS at 10:10 from New York. So how do you actually synthesize a policy that crosses those identity boundaries? Really easy to do with Entra and policies to spot that type of curious behavior. When you extend it across another cloud, that's a different story. And so you need an aggregate governance fabric between those clouds to do that.
So I'm digging the monitoring part. We've talked about monitoring about this, and I understand, Eric, from you that what the challenge is coverage in many ways, and collation in some ways. But I was very surprised that in addition to the picture you painted, Uli, you didn't say anything. I mean, I think of security as like this cool emergent property, like that you never get to, right? You never get to secure, right? So this would presume, so from an architect's point of view, how does the fact that this is never done come into play? Like, that's the thing. Like it's cool you set this up, because the first thought I had was like, oh, he just painted a really rosy picture of like, you got it working, you get it all working. Like, you work your way up and eventually get it all working. But I don't think that stays that way in security, right? It's never like, congratulations, you built it, the house is done, we're good, we're now secure, see you later, right?
How do you say this, David? That's the first time you said that I painted a rosy picture. Normally,
well,
I'm the
we are a
time.
bunch of cynics on this.
Wait a second, life is more complicated.
Yeah. No, but so how does an architect then take into account sort of the changing nature of the situation, right? Because the threats change, right? So presumably the solution has to at least include those. And are you then really hoping your provider is keeping up, or how much of that is on you and how much is on your provider? Like, let me ask it that way.
The way I think about it is, first, there's setting up security and zero trust architecture in the cloud,
Right.
a single cloud. And then there's doing so across the clouds. So that's the way I would kind of to tier it. So you certainly have all of these signals, and let's assume that you've done it with Azure, and now you've just contracted with AWS, and now you're trying to figure out, how do I accommodate for role-based access across my 2 clouds.
Right.
The question becomes like, well, now we need to have a unified identity provider. And one of those has to be in charge to enforce federated authentication across the cloud platforms. you have to figure out what protocol you're going to use. SAML, OpenID, OAuth 2.0, maybe all of those depending on the technology or the service or the UX that's accessing the resource across the clouds. You have to think about role drift, which is something that I got educated on recently around, if you have consistent RBAC models implemented very similarly across two clouds, you want to make sure that changes to the RBAC for a specific user in one cloud actually carries forward and is enforced in the other cloud. And without it, you have these role drifts happening where you have inconsistent permissioning. That may be okay. It may be desired in certain circumstances. In many circumstances, for regulated data or sensitive data, it may not be. And then there's zero trust federation as well. If you've got this continuous model of trusting and revalidating the security posture of a device, of a user, of a specific location, and part of a single operation is to cross clouds with that security context, then the zero trust principle has to have a transition point as well. So continuous authentication and re-authentication, if not planned carefully, will incur latency in the experience, and it may downright break the experience if you haven't tested or prepared for it. So all these things require a lot of thinking.
Okay, let's just pause it right here because I want to give enough room for us to talk about a really important question, which is how does an architect take into account the changing nature of security? So join us in part 2 of Armchair Architects as part of the Azure Essentials Show.